Oh no, oh no, oh no. Matt realized he had just made a grave mistake in his career, and now the boss of the company demanded his immediate presence. With a sinking feeling in his stomach, he got up from his desk and headed for Dan Connor's office. His mind was spinning with anxiety. There was no way Dan could have known what had happened. Being both an accountant and CEO, Matt was the only one who was privy to all the intricacies of the company's financial operations. As far as he knew, by the end of each month, all the bills were in order. Matt felt beads of sweat form on his forehead as he hesitantly knocked on the door. He tried to calm his nerves by reminding himself that Dan rarely bothered to scrutinize confusing financial statements unless there were glaring errors in the figures. Dan was too preoccupied with his luxurious lifestyle, expensive cars, and endless pursuit of women. Dan entered the room and motioned for Matt to sit down, his expression serious. Matt's false sense of security evaporated instantly. "I guess the main question is, how long have you been cheating on me?" Dan's words hit Matt like a brick, making his head swim with panic. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, denying any wrongdoing. Then Dan presented transaction logs showing that a large amount of money went through one of Matt's personal accounts and was then returned to the company. Caught in the act, Matt confessed, "I'm sorry, Dan. I just needed a temporary loan until the loan company contacted me. We would have lost the new house that Susan wanted. I didn't steal it, I paid it off quickly before the end of the month. I'm not sure if they consider it theft or fraud, Matt, but the consequences are serious. You could get a prison sentence and lose your job. I trusted you, but now I'm not sure I can trust you anymore," Dan said. "Please give me a chance to explain everything. It was a mistake in judgment. I've been devoted to this company for almost 2 decades and I've never crossed this line before. I promise it won't happen again," Matt begged. Dan stood by the window, lost in thought. "You and Susan have been my longtime friends, which only adds to the frustration of this situation. Did Susan know about your actions?" The question caught Matt off guard because it was actually Susan's idea. She was so afraid of losing the house that she suggested the idea to Matt, promising that no one would ever know the truth. Matt believed that by involving Susan, Dan might not report the incident to the authorities, but he did not dare to involve her in this case. After some thought, he simply replied, "No, she didn't know. It was my idea." Dan seemed shocked by Matt's response but waved it off. "I need time to think about it, Matt. I do not know what is the best way to proceed. Go home and don't come back until the end of the week. I'll make a decision by Friday." As Matt walked home, he couldn't figure out how Dan found out about this. No one discussed the deal, and Dan wasn't privy to the details. He was most concerned about which option Dan would choose in the end. None of the proposed options seemed tempting to him, but the fear of a trial and possible imprisonment led him into a state of panic. He knew perfectly well that Susan would not be waiting for him to return. Looking at their newly purchased house, he couldn't help but feel deep regret that he had bought this place in the first place. Memories flashed through his head of stories in which a man returning home found his wife in the midst of an affair. Could such a scenario mean the end of a day that was supposed to be perfect? But when he went into the kitchen, he was relieved to find Susan there, cheerful and well-dressed as always. He was delighted with her beauty again. At 40, she exuded elegance and grace. Her luxurious curls cascaded over her deep brown eyes, framing her face. He couldn't help but notice how her figure had grown prettier over the years, with more curves and cleavage than when they first exchanged vows. But what really won him over was her smile, which he knew he would miss in the coming days. Matt recounted his conversation with Dan and presented the evidence he had gathered, looking forward to Susan's reaction. "Oh dear, I'm sorry. It's all because of me. This whole mess was my idea, all for the sake of this ridiculous house," she said bitterly. Matt sighed. "I warned Dan that you were not involved in this." "There's no point in both of us getting into trouble," Matt replied. "Maybe I'll try to talk to him and explain," Susan suggested. Matt thought about it but eventually suggested they just wait. He knew the next 3 days would be agonizing. If Dan decided to go for the kill, they could try to beg. Matt couldn't help but wonder what he would have done in Dan's place. They were friends, socialized outside the office, and often attended parties together. Perhaps this connection opened up small opportunities for him. Dan sent a message saying that he would come to their house at 7 o'clock on Friday evening. Matt and Susan were looking forward to his arrival. Dan arrived in his Aston Martin as planned. Matt thought, a man who seems to have everything: looks, wealth, charisma, and now the ability to destroy it all. Dan was led inside, greeted with forced smiles, and Susan, as always, handed him a beer. Before he could respond, Matt intervened. "I just want to apologize, Dan. I know I screwed up a lot and let you down. I have put myself in a difficult position, and I'm ready for any consequences." Dan smiled strangely in response. "I hope you're serious, Matt." The silence that followed seemed to last forever until Dan finally spoke. "I have to admit, I envy your relationship with Susan, Matt. I miss that kind of connection in my life," Dan suddenly said. Matt was stunned by Dan's confession. He had always believed that Dan had everything, including an endless parade of attractive girlfriends. Perhaps approaching the age of 30, Dan wanted to settle down. "Considering this, I have a suggestion. It may not be ideal for each of you, but it's the only solution that can keep you out of jail, Matt, and it's important to consider the potential risks to Susan," Dan said. "Since the account was shared and used to buy a house in both your names, I know you wouldn't have taken such action without her approval," he added. Matt felt a surge of panic at the thought of Susan having to face the consequences. He didn't know what the consequences might be. Dan took a deep breath before speaking. "It's hard to say, but I suggest spending time with Susan," Dan proposed. There was a shocked silence in the room. Dan explained, "No law enforcement intervention, no court proceedings or imprisonment. You can continue your work and stay together. I'll be spending every Friday night with her," he added. "Dan, are you serious?" Matt whispered. "Yes," Dan replied firmly. "I've wanted Susan for so long, and I can't miss this chance. There must be another solution. We can offer more money, anything but this," Susan began to say before Dan interrupted her. "This is the only way out for you. I've been told that I look good. I hope it's not too difficult for you," he said. "Maybe when everything calms down, the situation won't be so unpleasant for each of us," Dan suggested. "We need time to think things through. Making such a decision on the spot is unwise," Susan said. Matt turned to Susan with an expression of disbelief on his face. "You can't really think about it, baby. Are you crazy?" Susan sighed. "Matt, we've been racking our brains for days trying to find another solution. I don't see any other way out, honey." Matt flushed with anger and looked at Dan. "You are a despicable excuse for a man. This idea is perverted and wrong." Dan smiled back at Matt and then turned to Susan. "Matt may think I'm a bastard, but I know I'm not, and you shouldn't waste time trying to figure it out," he said firmly. After a heated argument that lasted 15 minutes, Dan stood up decisively. "It's time to make a decision. I'm either going to the car or going upstairs with Susan," he announced, holding out his hand to her with a smile. Susan hesitated for a moment before finally taking his hand. Matt leaned back in his chair, stunned by Susan's words. "We have no other choice," she said calmly, assuring him that everything would be fine. She then led Dan through the living room and up the stairs, leaving Matt in a state of shock. Time seemed to stand still as Matt took in what had just happened. There was an eerie silence in the room, and the weight of the conversation hung in the air. Thoughts of what was happening upstairs raced through his mind. He could hear faint movements and murmuring voices, and then he distinctly heard someone settling down on the bed. The reality of the situation hit him like a brick, and he felt depressed and unsure of what to expect next. The silent minutes dragged on, seeming like hours. Eventually, a faint creak broke through the silence, heralding the beginning of the intimacy of two people. The sounds of their actions became louder and clearer. The rhythm of the creaking bed coincided with the muffled moans that filled the room. The intensity increased, the sounds became faster and clearer. It seemed endless, making Matt doubt his sanity. A sense of shame and guilt overwhelmed him, and he wiped away tears, anticipating Dan and Susan's return downstairs. But the quiet conversations and movements continued, and Matt felt worried and didn't know what to do next. After a long silence, Matt got up from his seat with a sudden desire to make sure Susan was all right. Listening carefully, he heard the unmistakable creak of the bed again as he headed for the stairs. He caught snatches of Dan's voice in conversation, but what really struck him was Susan's incessant whimpering, accompanied by quiet wailing and moaning. Unable to bear this unsettling atmosphere any longer, Matt realized that he had to leave the house. Hurriedly leaving, he walked aimlessly down the street. Was Susan really enjoying herself, or was she just pretending in front of Dan? He couldn't help but wonder how serious her objections were. The thought that Dan was 10 years younger and more attractive did not leave him. As he walked towards the park, his perspective changed. Susan's actions were motivated by a desire to protect him from trouble with the law. Realizing this, he hurried back to the house to ensure her safety. The Aston Martin remained parked on the street, but when he went inside, the house became eerily quiet. On his way to the kitchen, he reached for a beer. Turning around, he was surprised to find Susan standing there in a short robe. They exchanged a confused look before Matt could ask, "Are you okay?" Susan smiled faintly and assured him, "Yes, thanks for asking." She hesitated and then added, "He's just being polite, nothing out of the ordinary." "I'm sorry if you overheard something." Matt shrugged, relieved that it was over, but Susan looked awkward when she confessed, "Actually, he wants to come again." "My throat was dry, so I took a beer and decided to see how you were doing," Matt said. "Why don't you go to the room? It'll make you feel better, and it's probably quieter there." "Try to figure out how to fix this," Susan said. Matt sat in the room for another hour but couldn't find a solution. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. As he stepped out into the hallway, he saw Dan trying to hide a smile before addressing Matt. "In this tense atmosphere, I know it's hard for you, Matt. I assure you, I will always treat Susan with the utmost respect. I am incredibly grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to spend time with her. Please take care of yourself and be sure that any work issues will remain a secret between us," Dan said. In response, Matt humbly replied, "You're welcome because you left us no other choice." Both Matt and Susan looked worried, signaling that it was time for Dan to leave. To Matt's surprise, when Dan was saying goodbye, Susan unexpectedly kissed him on the cheek. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but it was a lingering touch on his lips. Matt barely had time to react before Dan disappeared. He turned to Susan, a look of confusion on his face. "What was that?" The realization of her mistake hit Susan like a brick. "What?" "It was just a goodbye kiss." Matt shook his head. "No, it was more than that. It was a gesture of affection. I think you had a good time, and I shouldn't have worried so much." Susan flushed with anger at these words. "I can't believe your boss took advantage of me 3 times because of what you did, and all you're worried about is a goodbye kiss." Susan exclaimed. "It was supposed to be a simple agreement, just making love." "Did you really kiss him upstairs?" Matt asked. "Well, maybe a little, but not much," she replied. "At first, it was only a few times, then as I heard you liked it and now you're being petted," Matt protested. Susan, feeling guilty, exclaimed, "It's not like that. All I'm doing is protecting us from getting caught and going to jail. It will require both of us to be open-minded and ensure he has a good time. We both need to adjust to the new situation. If I can handle it, then you have to find a way to handle it," she added. Matt felt depressed after that last remark. Despite disapproving of Susan's choice, it was she who had to sacrifice, not him. She could have easily walked away, leaving him to deal with the consequences alone. He knew he couldn't sleep in the master bedroom, haunted by what had happened there, so they settled on the guest room. Susan and Matt snuggled up to each other. Susan quickly fell asleep from fatigue, but Matt did not sleep. His thoughts were in constant turmoil. He was desperately looking for a way out of a difficult situation. They hardly spoke for the next week. Their only conversations revolved around how to escape. Matt considered various plans, most of which turned out to be useless, and even when he came up with an acceptable solution, it seemed that Dan was always one step ahead. One of the proposals suggested erasing all traces of evidence, but it turned out that Dan had denied him access to backups and insisted that all financial data be securely stored in a new cloud system. Next Friday, Dan texted Matt, saying that he planned to invite Susan to dinner, claiming that this would help resolve the situation. Matt wasn't sure if a date would really make things easier. It seemed that this could lead to a closer relationship, but at the same time, it was questionable. By spending less time in bed with Susan, he ended up in a difficult situation. Susan seemed very upset about their date, but she was preparing for it anyway. Matt thought she had put in too much effort and looked too stunning when Dan arrived to ask her out. Seeing her in a stylish black dress and high heels, getting into Dan's fancy car was heartbreaking. The following night became even more difficult for him. He sent Susan several messages to check on how she was feeling. Each time, he received only brief answers in which she said that she was fine, just having dinner or just drinking. It wasn't until 10 o'clock that they finally returned. Dan hugged Susan as they entered the house, both laughing and in high spirits. Matt looked around and noticed that Susan was having a great time again and looked pretty drunk. "We didn't agree that you would be dating," Matt said. Dan calmed him down by saying, "Relax, Matt. It was just dinner and a drink between friends. It's going to be uncomfortable for me. Maybe it's better to get it over with right away," Matt grumbled. "What do you mean immediately?" Dan asked, his smile returning. "We have a deal for every Friday, Matt, so I'm going to sleep with Susan tonight, and I'm sure you can do it in the spare room," Dan explained. Despite the fact that Susan was drunk, she felt the tension between the two men and was afraid that Matt might lash out at Dan. She quickly led him into the kitchen, whispering, "It's going to be okay, honey. I'll deal with it quickly and then pretend to be drunk and go to bed." Matt accepted that they had no other choice. With a heavy heart, he left, consumed by a deep sense of helplessness. As they climbed the stairs, Susan's laughter echoed through the house, and Matt wondered if it was meant for Dan or for himself. Exhausted and defeated, Matt eventually found solace in a spare bedroom for the night. Every time he woke up from a nap, the creaking of the bed in the next room reminded him of the mess of his emotions. The next morning, as Matt walked down the stairs, he came to terms with the reality of their situation. Dan was already sitting at the table, watching Susan prepare breakfast. Matt had reached the limit of his patience. "Get lost, Dan. It's not Friday anymore, and your hospitality here has expired," Matt stated. Susan tried to defuse the situation by saying, "Don't be rude, Matt. Let's try to be polite." But Matt interrupted her with a final warning to Dan, "You have 10 seconds to leave my territory." Dan seemed about to object but changed his mind and got up to leave. As he headed for the door, he couldn't resist one last barb. "Don't forget what's at stake here, Matt," he warned before leaving. Matt looked at Susan, raising an eyebrow. "Should I make him breakfast?" "Seriously, why not just move in with him at this point?" "You look more like his wife than mine," he remarked, then hurriedly left the room, leaving Susan speechless. Dan suggested they stay at a hotel on the third Friday to avoid conflicts with Matt. Susan, dressed in her usual outfit, left at 6 o'clock in the evening, believing that it would be less difficult for Matt. She was supposed to change into something more appropriate at the hotel while Dan was waiting for her at the restaurant. In the luxury of the hotel, Susan felt out of place in casual clothes. She was surprised to discover that the room they had booked was actually a suite, which further increased her sense of awe. There was a beautiful bouquet of flowers on the table and 2 elegantly packed boxes on the bed. Curious, she opened the larger box and found a stunning silver satin dress with a plunging neckline and a bold slit. The second box contained a matching red satin corset, a thong, and luxurious black stockings. She was hesitant at first but decided to try them on anyway, and to her surprise, they fit her perfectly. Admiring herself in the mirror, she felt incredibly impressive and confident. She decided not to take off her underwear and went to the restaurant. Dan greeted her, amazed at how beautiful Susan looked. The dinner and wine that followed were delicious. There was tension in the air, anticipating what was about to happen. In Dan's presence, Susan felt at ease and decided not to resist but to accept the situation. Back in the room, Susan felt Dan slowly and sensually take off her clothes, enjoying the way he appreciated her underwear. His fingers danced over every curve of her body, sending shivers of pleasure down her spine. The corset accentuated her ample breasts and graceful hips, making her feel sexy and desirable. The feel of the silky stockings on her skin was luxurious, and she couldn't get enough of it. Dan was a passionate and attentive lover. His touch was both caring and bold. There was a hint of danger in his eyes that aroused her in a way her husband never had. The morning after their passionate encounter, Susan changed into her casual clothes. Knowing she couldn't risk bringing home any evidence of her forbidden relationship with Dan, Dan agreed to keep the items at his home so that Susan could use them in the future. Susan sighed, realizing that this agreement would be long-term. Emotions overwhelmed her, and she tried to figure out how she felt about the current situation. Guilt weighed on her, but she couldn't ignore the feeling of anticipation and satisfaction. By 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, Matt was still awake, waiting for Susan to return. She broke their agreement again. He doubted very much that Dan would be able to resist being around Susan this morning, and he was afraid that she wouldn't even try to avoid the situation. Despite his best efforts not to give up, his faith in Susan was running out. If he continued to lose confidence in her, it could mean the end of their marriage. He felt even more distant from Susan than ever before and incredibly isolated. That ill-fated kiss had led to a rift between them that seemed insurmountable. This had upset Matt a lot, and now breakfast with Dan loomed ahead, reminding him of his poor judgment. What was he thinking? Susan began to seriously doubt the whole situation. From her point of view, spending time with Dan was much easier than she had imagined. He was attractive and brought an element of excitement into her life. Money and fancy cars didn't hurt either. She had always dreamed of a more luxurious lifestyle. However, the problem was that the passion she shared with Dan was strong, too strong. She had to constantly fight against impulses and resist the irresistible desire for more. She hoped Matt would eventually come to his senses and look at the situation from her point of view. But after 3 weeks, his sullenness persisted, and she felt out of place. She was consumed by a deep desire to make love to him, but they hadn't crossed that line yet. She really wanted to change this, as she loved him very much and regretted the situation. She tried to sort out her feelings with Matt, assuring him that she was doing a great job and he shouldn't blame himself. She even mentioned that Dan was kind to her, but it was purely a physical affection that could not replace the love she felt for Matt. Despite trying to convey her thoughts to him, Matt looked depressed and distant. His constant presence in her life had now turned into a fading memory. When Dan arrived at work on Monday, he told Matt that he had to go to a training session out of town on Wednesday and Thursday next week. Matt was hesitant at first, but because of the situation at work, he reluctantly agreed. I agree, but to be clear, it doesn't change anything in our personal relationship. You won't be able to come when I'm not at home, Matt said. Dan assured him, of course not. Later that evening, when Matt informed Susan about the trip, she didn't look shocked or worried. Such courses were held infrequently, only once or twice a year. It all seemed too perfect to Matt. He headed for the kitchen, intending to figure out how to get out of the predicament he found himself in, but his plans were thwarted by a throbbing headache. As he was climbing the stairs in search of painkillers, he heard Susan talking on the phone. Curious, he listened to her conversation, wondering who she was talking to. Why are you sending Matt on a trip? No, this is an unwise decision. The situation is already difficult, and your participation will only complicate everything even more. No, he hasn't come up with a solution yet. He seems to have accepted defeat and feels defeated. I did not expect such an outcome. He's heartbroken despite the fact that it was my suggestion. I did not expect his violent reaction. The plan was designed so that we could safely spend time together without fear of being caught. I never imagined that it would turn out this way, she said. I kissed you at breakfast, and you were being arrogant and grinning in his face. You can come during his trip, but we may have to limit our interaction or stop it altogether. If you propose to terminate this agreement because of its effect on Matt, you will be considered a good person, and we can return to normal life. Maybe if we're careful, we can still see each other sometimes. We'll discuss this later, but right now my first priority is to establish a relationship with Matt, she said quietly into the phone. No matter what, I still love him, she ended the conversation. Matt struggled down the stairs, and the full weight of the situation hit him like a physical blow. He could not comprehend the consequences of what he had just heard. Now it became clear why Dan was always one step ahead. Susan had been providing him with information all this time. It was her idea to borrow the money, and she convinced Matt to do it against his instincts. Now it became clear how Dan even found out about the error. The secret was so well hidden that he doubted that even a thorough check would be able to uncover it. Despite the fact that he was married to a woman who protected him from trouble, he could not get rid of the feeling that his other half was actually a lying and unreliable person. Vindictive and cruel thoughts assailed him, but he knew that he had to remain calm and think logically. He devised a plan to make them question his behavior, hoping to uncover the truth. Avoiding Susan for the rest of the night and the next morning, Matt considered his next move. When he saw Susan on Tuesday evening, he decided not to bring up the subject of the overheard conversation. Instead, he mentioned that he had heard Dan brag at work that he had a high-class woman. Matt hoped Dan hadn't mentioned Susan. The next morning, Matt went on a trip, and Susan confessed her love to him. He smiled briefly and pretended to be concerned, checking the schedule on his phone before leaving. On Wednesday morning, Dan showed up at Susan's house, and she didn't waste time asking about the bragging incident. Despite Dan's denial and his accusations against Matt of causing problems, Susan didn't know who to believe. She couldn't understand why Matt would make up such a story, but she began to doubt that Dan was as careful as she had first thought, which created a potential problem. During their intimacy, Susan and Dan discussed the current situation and considered possible solutions. Susan realized that the emotional connection she shared with Matt was missing from her relationship with Dan, which was purely physical. Despite her doubts, Dan managed to convince Susan to extend their romance until his departure on Thursday afternoon. Susan firmly stated that this would be the last time until her relationship with Matt improved. When they left the house, Dan froze in shock at the sight before him. A sharp kitchen knife lay threateningly on the hood of his Aston Martin. He looked around the area but saw no one. To his horror, all 4 tires were cut. Hurriedly returning to the house, Dan informed Susan about the unpleasant discovery. They both panicked, thinking that Matt might have returned home earlier than expected. He had to be the culprit, unless it was naughty kids or someone envious of a luxury car. This was not the first case of vandalism. Susan called Matt to ask how the class was going. He calmly replied that everything went without incident and began to prepare for departure. He didn't mention Dan and spoke calmly. Susan expressed her excitement about meeting him and quickly ended the conversation. She later recounted the conversation to Dan, noting that Matt didn't seem upset. Maybe it was the neighbors. Anyway, they needed to tow the car before Matt got home. As a result of the situation, several frantic calls and expensive payments followed. When Matt returned home on Thursday evening, everything seemed normal. Susan, pretending to be an obedient wife, walked around him on tiptoe. The real surprise came when Dan sent a text message confirming that he wanted to come on Friday to discuss the situation. Susan couldn't help but smile, thinking that Dan was finally going to put an end to everything. Perhaps the incident with the car had scared him enough to stop. When Matt went to work on Friday morning, there was tension in the air. At 11 o'clock in the morning, Susan got a call from Matt at work. He urgently informed her that she needed to see something important. Matt explained that he had just received a video clip on their personal email that she needed to watch. Susan quickly opened their email on her phone, found the message, and turned on the video. Despite the poor quality and short duration, only 20 seconds, it was clear that Susan and Dan were making love in the video. The sender was an anonymous address. "Oh my God, is this our bedroom? It's hard to make out, but it seems to be sunny there. It seems to be noon, but I can't say for sure," Matt asked. Susan knew the time perfectly well, but she just answered, "I'm not sure. Perhaps the frame has been edited and the lighting is off." "Matt, you sent the video, didn't you?" she asked. "You seem to like it," he replied sarcastically. Susan didn't pay much attention to this remark. She had more pressing matters to attend to, and she could discuss her worries with Matt later when he arrived home. Matt persisted, insisting that what Dan was planning was the topic he wanted to touch on that evening. He asked if this was a form of torture, noting that Susan did not lose her temper and did not threaten Dan. Susan denied it at first, but then remembered that she had told Dan about her plans to end the relationship. She wondered if Dan's reaction to the news was negative and if he had rigged the video in an attempt to save their relationship. Dan had 2 days to plan, and he had plenty of opportunities to do so. Matt noted that Dan was not at work. Susan desperately wanted to get in touch with him to discuss their recent affairs. At that moment, her phone buzzed with an urgent call me notification. It was her sister Diana. Susan knew she had to answer, hoping it would give her time to collect her thoughts. She hung up on Matt and dialed Diana's number but was bombarded with questions and criticism. Susan discovered that her sister had also received the same video clip. Her phone was constantly buzzing with calls from close friends and even her mother. Could it be that they all got the same video? Susan couldn't believe it. It was a complete disaster. There was no way Matt could be behind this. It had to be Dan. Susan was furious. She tried to call Dan several times, but he didn't answer the phone. She didn't know that Matt had taken Dan's phone while he was in a meeting at work. He threw away the battery but left the phone and SIM card, tossing them in the trash and leaving an envelope on Dan's desk. He called Susan to discuss the video and then quietly left work. When Matt got home, he enjoyed watching his wife get upset and confused. She was distressed that her mother had seen the video and worried about what her family and friends would think. Matt continued to fuel her anxiety by making useless suggestions. Susan continued to ignore Dan's midweek visit, unable to shake off the feelings of regret and guilt that consumed her. How could everything have gotten out of control so quickly? She had never imagined herself capable of having an affair until that fateful night at the party when alcohol spurred her flirtation with Dan. His charm and interest in her were undeniable, and she couldn't resist his advances. After a few weeks, Susan began to justify her actions, convincing herself that she deserved a little thrill in her life. But deep down, she was tormented by doubts about when the video could have been made and her careless treatment of Dan, which reinforced her growing sense of anxiety. She was hesitant to jeopardize her relationship with Matt, seeing her friend's marriage crumble because of such indiscretion. She was wary but believed that her plan was cunning enough to avoid any consequences. The idea that Matt would find out about the affair seemed unlikely because he already knew about it. Thinking through the logistics turned into an exciting puzzle for her. She saw it as a brilliant decision but didn't think about how it would affect Matt. She was in agony. Everyone adored Matt and knew that she had betrayed him. The thought of having to justify her actions terrified her. How could she explain herself? No one would believe that Matt knew about her affair with Dan. But none of that mattered as long as she could convince Matt that it wasn't her fault. The screeching of tires announced Dan's arrival at Matt and Susan's house. Susan met him with a furious onslaught. Matt stood off to the side, blankly watching the deep scratch on Dan's cheek. After some effort, Dan managed to pin Susan against the wall until she finally spoke. Despite the fact that Dan found out about the video, he categorically denied that he filmed or sent it. Susan became increasingly upset and demanded to know who was to blame for this if not him. Surprisingly, Matt started laughing and admitted that it must have been him. Susan and Dan were speechless. Dan was the first to understand the truth. "So you found out about our meeting this week," Matt calmly confessed. Alas, yes, Susan tried to explain it as a continuation of their agreement, but Dan quickly realized the significance of the video. Knowing that they had already discussed this issue earlier, he felt that Matt had recorded the entire incident. Trying to relieve the tension, Dan apologized to Matt. "I'm sorry, Matt. I couldn't control myself," Dan said. Susan interjected, "I never meant to hurt you. I made a mistake in judgment and let my emotions get the better of me. I will terminate the contract and ignore the financial differences," Dan said. "That's very kind of you, but I'm sorry. Everything has already been done." "You will see my resignation letter on your desk," Matt replied. "You can't do this, Matt. How can we buy back the house?" Susan intervened. "Don't worry, dear. The house will be for sale tomorrow," Matt reassured her. Dan quickly added, "Don't resign, Matt. We can survive this. The firm really needs you. You have a deep understanding of the business and our customers." Matt smiled. "I think it's true. It seems that's why your main competitor made me a job offer. I have a feeling that many, if not most, of our customers will follow me. Since you owe me more vacation days than the 4-week deadline, I'm not coming back." Dan's insincere smile disappeared when Matt spoke again. "I think some of our colleagues will leave too. I informed them of my departure, and it seems they doubt your ability to support the company." Dan said rudely, "You really should change your mind, Matt. You could end up in jail." "I doubt it very much, Dan. Do you want to involve your mistress in this case? She received half of the fraudulent payments, not to mention that you tried to blackmail me. And now I have your confession on video, thanks to a small device that I purchased. The recording is now in the hands of my lawyer. Also, you may notice that some of your files have mysteriously disappeared, and I know that you haven't backed them up remotely. It's always good to have supportive colleagues, but you don't seem to know about it," Matt said with a grin. "This tape will never appear in the courtroom," Dan replied. "Interestingly, my lawyer said something completely different. But I have other plans for her, and when all is said and done, your business will be in ruins. On the other hand, my new company may acquire yours. I heard that their new CEO is a good guy." Susan understood that Dan's wealth and business were at risk compared to her own. She decided to take action against him. Dan was speechless when Susan began to pose as a victim, claiming that this was all Dan's idea and that she was forced to do it to save him from prison. She confessed her love for Matt and asked for his forgiveness, blaming her confusion in Dan's actions. Dan couldn't believe the audacity of her lies and muttered to himself, calling her two-faced lying trash. Matt just smiled at how accurately Dan described Susan. "My dear wife, it has dawned on me that in addition to the incriminating video, I also overheard you admit on the phone that this scheme was your doing, a deceptive cover for an affair. The divorce papers are waiting for you in the kitchen drawer. You're leaving tonight, and you have to fulfill the terms of the divorce, otherwise, these videos may get to our loved ones. Your mother will undoubtedly be saddened to learn of your infidelity," Matt said. Susan was sobbing uncontrollably as she collapsed to the ground. Matt turned to Dan with a sly smile on his face. "Do you think we should take her with us?" Dan shook his head and replied, "No way. She's caused us more trouble than she's worth." Matt nodded in agreement and added, "I couldn't agree more." Dan warned, "It's not over yet, Matt." Grinning, Matt replied, "It's true." Suddenly, in a fit of rage, Matt hit Dan. His fist smashed into Dan's jaw, sending him to the ground. He couldn't tell who was more shocked by the sudden turn of events. Now it was the end. Matt replayed the recording several times, lamenting most of it but finding satisfaction in the part where Dan and Susan worried about his possible exposure and subsequent descent into madness, a knife stuck in a hood as a melodrama that he couldn't help but appreciate. A rare smile graced his lips after weeks of tension. After getting a new job at a rival company, Matt successfully lured customers and employees away, winning the ultimate act of revenge. Dan held on as long as he could, but in the end, he was forced to declare his business bankrupt. Rumors began to spread about his own financial collapse, and soon after, he quietly left the area. Susan stayed in a modest apartment with the proceeds from the sale of the house since Matt did not provide her with any financial support. Having no skills or work experience, she got 2 temporary jobs as a maid and a waitress. Her once close circle of friends turned away from her, and she became estranged from her mother and sister. After receiving a raise in salary and bonuses, Matt was able to switch to a 3-day work week, which allowed him to finally set aside time for sports and outdoor activities, which he had neglected during his marriage. He realized how much Susan had influenced his decisions, from buying a big house to filling it with unnecessary things. Deciding to change the situation, Matt wasted no time selling the house and reducing the number of things. Despite the breakup of his marriage, Matt continued to communicate with his mother and sister. Susan's sister Diana, in particular, constantly apologized for Susan's infidelity and assured Matt that she would never repeat her mistake. This support helped Matt move forward and focus on rebuilding his life. It would be great to reveal this information at some point, especially because Susan would be furious. Story 2. Louis Honoris, a 33-year-old man, sat on a recently cleaned bench made of marine teak and iron, which overlooked Lake Rife. In the past, he and his family had gone boating on the lake more than once. He studied the shiny brass plaque on the bench that the Edmonds family of Mossy Rock donated in honor of their grandfather Kennewick Edmonds. The sign said that the bench was intended for everyone so that they could appreciate the natural beauty of the surroundings, which their grandfather treasured so much. Louis, being a local resident, couldn't help but smile bitterly as he read the inscription. He understood why old Kennewick had a special love for this place, especially considering that there was a bench in his honor. From the observation deck, there was a beautiful view of the crystal blue water that now covered Kennewick's childhood home, thanks to the mossy rock dam built by Tacoma City Light many years ago to power the city. For Lewis, it was a bittersweet reminder of the past. He knew that the city of Rife existed somewhere, but it was hidden 60 feet below the sparkling surface of the lake. The water reflected the stunning blue sky and the ragged clouds above it. Native pines grew in the forest surrounding the lake, and western white pines reached a height of more than 36 feet. Since childhood, Lewis had dreamed of climbing one of these tall trees and seeing if he could reach the endless sky above. A dear memory of his father remained in his mind. When he was a little boy, they spent a peaceful afternoon on the shore of the lake, lying on their backs and leaning G.L. Leonard's bamboo fishing rods against a tree. The rods were ready to catch salmon that filled the waters of the lake. Together, they looked at the sky, admiring the beauty of nature and enjoying a moment of relaxation. It was at this time that he shared with his father his desire to climb to the top of one of the tall pines. Lewis's father was silent for several minutes, completely ignoring Lewis's words, and so when Lewis began to think that his father had not heard him, he suddenly began to hum the melody from the Jimi Hendrix song Purple Haze, "Excuse me while I kiss the sky." My father sang, his voice not too melodious despite his lack of singing talent. His father was never shy about humming a tune. Whenever he sang this line, an exhausted Lewis looked around, hoping that there was no one nearby who could witness his father singing the song out of tune. In adulthood, the memories of this incident remain vivid and pleasant for Lewis. The loss of both parents to cancer at a young age, as well as his knowledge of genetics, played a role in this meeting. The brevity of life became clear to him. Lewis drew attention to the nearly 23-meter-long lake, which was shrouded in darkness, symbolizing the loss that had befallen the once vibrant Riff community. The darkness hid all traces of its presence so that it would never be born again. Lewis saw this as a fitting comparison to his marriage to an outsider. Unaware of the turmoil he had experienced, this scene might have seemed peaceful with the beauty of the warm autumn weather in the Pacific Northwest. Despite the outdated name, the locals still called this period of time Indian summer. There is no better time and place on Earth for its onset. This makes 9 months of dreary rains almost unbearable. Although Lewis looked calm on the outside, he was full of anger on the inside. He had to face this nightmare alone. Being the only child who had few friends outside the fire station, none of the guys at the station could provide Lewis with support. As is shown on TV, firefighters rarely discuss their fears and emotions or share intimate moments with colleagues. Showing weakness is seen as a threat to trust and can lead to serious consequences. In life-threatening situations, every moment is important, and any hesitation caused by uncertainty about a teammate's abilities can be deadly. In this aspect, Lewis felt completely isolated. He deliberately decided to arrive early because he believed in the healing properties of his beloved lake and natural oils. He hoped that they would help him reschedule the upcoming meeting with his already ex-wife, which she had asked for. The lawyer advised him to agree to the meeting, as it would benefit his case in the family court. Despite the advice of a lawyer, Blaine opposed this process, and his lawyer was very unhappy. Lewis was puzzled by Blaine's stubborn belief that their marriage would be able to withstand her mental state. She adamantly demanded mandatory consultations with her lawyer, despite the fact that the judge of the family court in Washington was unable to obtain them. Both lawyers tried to reason with Blaine, but their efforts were unsuccessful. Lewis believed Blaine needed therapy, but he no longer felt responsible for her well-being. He sighed to himself, resigned to the fact that their marriage would end on that day. Blaine could have asked for a meeting, but Lewis was adamantly opposed to meeting on the spot. He was sure that the summer crowds had already dispersed, and the place for them remained empty. This meeting wasn't supposed to go the way Blaine had planned. Glancing at his watch, he noted that she would be arriving soon, but he knew he had plenty of time. After all, Blaine had a long drive ahead of her on a 12-kilometer highway that she hated. Punctuality was not her strong suit, as evidenced by her tardiness on the wedding day. She arrived an hour late, which made him chuckle cynically as the memories came flooding back. He remembered a joke from his best man 13 years ago, who suggested that he leave the church after being only 20 minutes late. But he quickly pushed the thought away. In truth, the first 12.5 years of his marriage to Blaine were the perfect dream. Lewis adored his two daughters, Rainer and Lacey, more than anything in the world. Rain, or Rainy as she was affectionately called, was a real daddy's girl. She had already started going to school and aspired to fulfill her dream of becoming a firefighter, which her father inspired her to do. At the same time, Lacey looked like her mother. For Lewis, this created another problem. Family courts prefer to keep children together, and in Washington state, there is no specific age when a child can choose which parent to live with after a divorce. Despite this, the lawyer assured him that there are still options. Washington's divorce and child custody laws can be complicated, but they allow a married couple to jointly draw up a child care plan that can be submitted to the court. If the judge considers the plan to be thorough, complete, and fair to children, it is usually approved without any changes. Lewis's lawyer advised him that the main thing was to convince his wife to agree to a difficult offer, which Lewis hoped she would eventually accept. Being a pragmatic person, Lewis understood how important it was to find a practical solution to their situation. Even before receiving confirmation from his lawyer, he realized that his position as a firefighter with the Riverside Fire Department, also known as the RFA, would most likely prevent him from obtaining primary custody of his daughters. The dangerous aspects of work and the irregular shift schedule have created significant difficulties in obtaining custody. It took a lot of time and financial resources to develop the plan that he initiated. As soon as he closed his eyes, he was transported back to that fateful day a few months before when his unimaginable nightmare began. He didn't know if he was living in an episode of The Twilight Zone or stuck in an endless loop like Groundhog Day. His reality seemed both surreal and frighteningly repetitive. "Lewis, honey, can we talk in the living room, please?" Her voice interrupted his routine as he put the girls to sleep in their room. Despite the fact that he needed to rest before his daily shift in the morning, he was looking forward to the opportunity to talk to his wife. He hoped Blaine shared his excitement about their shared goal of owning their own home. Currently, the four of them lived in a rented 3-bedroom apartment, but now that their careers were stable, they couldn't wait to get a permanent home. They both believed that it would be much better and safer to raise their daughters in their own home. As he walked into the living room, thoughts of their future together were spinning in his head. Taking a bottle of water from the refrigerator, he went into the kitchen and settled down on the familiar worn sofa that he inherited from his parents. Turning to Blaine, he swung his right leg over his left and carefully tucked her loose blonde hair behind her ear. Putting his hand on her shoulder, he asked, "How are you, honey?" Further memories were hazy for him. The memories of their conversation were mostly fragmentary soul-piercing heartbeats in a kaleidoscope of shock, disbelief, and anger. But his reaction was crystal clear. Months later, he was still puzzled by how shockingly weak and emotional his reaction was. He was crying, really crying, in front of her. It was so pathetic that he felt sorry for Blaine. He stumbled out of the house and walked away from the source of his torment. One of the positive aspects of a firefighter's job was the availability of a free cot where you could sleep without asking questions about your constant presence. The team was aware of the high divorce rate in their profession. As the days passed, he gradually gathered together the information that his wife had shared with him. She did not ask his permission but simply informed him of her plans. When he returned home, he planned to beg his wife not to leave the family and think about visiting a psychologist together to try to save their marriage. As soon as he started, he was suddenly surprised by the unexpected appearance of his affectionate and naive daughters. Blaine assured him that they would be waiting for him at her parents' house. Turning around, he saw his wife standing with a sly, triumphant smile on her face. The love he had once felt for her was gone, replaced by fierce hatred. He stared at Blaine, and his usually calm expression twisted with rage, close to madness. The expression of superiority disappeared, replaced by fear. At that moment, his daughters launched a full-scale attack in innocent confusion. They demanded to know why he was leaving them. He had to break free from the tight embrace of Rain and Lacey, who were begging, screaming, and crying. Rain was crying especially hard. "Dad, how can I become a firefighter without you?" He knew that this heartbreaking moment would haunt him for the rest of his days. Despite the end result, Lewis understood that in the future, the possible consequences for his comrades would be even more deplorable. In the end, he was grateful to Blaine. In an instant, he turned from a vulnerable target into a determined man with clear intentions. Instantly, Lewis mentally expressed his gratitude. He regained his self-respect and began the first stages of healing. He admitted that it was not easy for them and expressed the hope that one day they would understand his act. My mom and I are not on the best of terms because we have different goals in life, but I want you to know that I will always be there for you. I will see you regularly and love you endlessly without looking back at Blaine. Lewis left his apartment for the last time, escaping from the arms of his daughters. Since that day, he has not spoken to his now ex-wife, preferring to entrust the case to his lawyer. Lewis didn't know if he was asleep or just lost in memories. "Hello, Lise. Thank you for coming to meet me," she said, her voice once soothing and caring, now resembling nails on a chalkboard. He shook his head to switch over. It's time to do what his lawyer advised. In an ideal world, he would never have to see her face again. He did not look in her direction but fixed his gaze on the lake, comforted by its calm presence. He noted her surprise with a small smile and finally turned to face her. "I understand that this is about you, Blaine," he began. "But before we go any further, I have to say something. This will be our last conversation on this topic. If you start coming up with the same hackneyed excuses again, then there will be no conversation, Louis." "I do not know." Blaine was sure that the marriage could not be saved. "If you mention again how much you love me, if you hint that the problems arise only because of my fragile female ego, if you even hint that I am to blame for the collapse of the family, I will leave. At the moment, your presence repels me to the point of physical nausea." "I love you," all I said, my voice full of emotion, as I gently touched her face. "But let me save you the trouble, Blaine." He gestured at a large manila envelope lying on the bench seat. "These are the divorce papers that will end our marriage. Take them with you when you leave. In a few minutes, your lawyer will review them and you will need to sign them and then return them to my lawyer's office within 36 hours. Turning away to admire the breathtaking view once more, he continued to speak. "My lawyer will check that all aspects of this agreement comply with the state's requirements for a parenting plan, but I'm not interested in prolonging the situation and I don't want to stay married to an unfaithful spouse, so it would be better for both of us to get divorced. It is very important to pay close attention to such details." Lewis sighed in disappointment, realizing that Blaine would probably complicate the situation even more. "The parenting plan is the most important aspect that the family court will pay attention to. My offer is reasonable given our limited savings. You will get custody of the girls and I will not argue with you about this decision." Blaine snorted. "Girls need a mother, and even though you weren't the best wife, you were a decent mother. You will leave the apartment so that the girls don't have to change schools or look for new friends. I will take over half of the housing costs and will pay alimony more than the required minimum. I will also meet my daughters regularly. Everything is described in detail in this agreement." A lot of emotions raced through Blaine's head. She felt surprise, joy, and sadness at the same time. She hoped that Lewis's love for their daughters would be enough to make him stay and save their marriage, but it was at that moment that Blaine realized the true extent of her loss and tears flowed of their own accord. "Look, Blaine," Lewis began, "the truth is with my busy work schedule and the dangers associated with my job, I know I have no chance of getting custody of the girls. Even if you got intimate with the entire Seahawks football team on the 50-yard line at halftime of a playoff game, it wouldn't change the truth. Ls, we can't. Please don't interrupt, Blaine, we're just getting down to business. It's very important that you listen carefully to what's going to happen next." He gave her an impatient look, took out a thick envelope the size of a letter from his pocket, and handed it to her. She opened it and began to examine the documents inside. "As I said before, if within 36 hours you do not sign the divorce paper and hand them over to my lawyer, a detailed report on what led to the breakup of our marriage, evidence of your infidelity, will be sent to everyone you know, including your family, colleagues, and supervisor. This document outlines what you have been doing and the consequences of failure will be costly." The cost of getting the investigator's report may have been high, but Lewis thought it was worth every penny. He was determined to ensure that his daughters fully understood how and why their family had been torn apart. Blaine, on the other hand, was stunned by the information contained in the report. It was difficult for her to accept that her lover was capable of such actions. She was sure Lewis was probably lying despite his doubts. Lewis understood that revealing the truth would cause his daughter great pain. He hesitated, not knowing if he had the strength to complete his plan to uncover the truth, but he hoped that it would not come to such extreme measures. In addition, he could face legal consequences, including imprisonment and loss of his job. The laws of retaliation against adult films posed a double threat. Besides, he hoped his wife would live up to Lewis's expectations. It is important to note that Blaine is not such a submissive and easily deceived person as is commonly believed. The main thing, Blaine, is that the documents are signed in accordance with my instructions. If your lawyer contacts mine and mentions me and my client, then you'll regret it. If he changes even one comma, period, or semicolon, the gloves will be off, and the whole world will know what you are. Blaine, shaken to the core, continued to scroll through the investigator's report throughout Lewis's monologue. She could only utter meaningless sounds, snort, and cry, only shaking her head in disbelief. This shouldn't have happened. Why can't Lewis understand? I propose a mutual agreement that will benefit both of us. In exchange for your cooperation, I assure you that I will never speak negatively of you or hold you responsible for the breakup of our family in the presence of our daughters. I'm even ready to be cordial towards your partner if we end up in the same place, for example, at our daughter's birthday party. I'll even shake his hand, no matter how unpleasant it is for me. I will behave respectfully and politely, as if we have decided to part amicably. I will show the same courtesy to your family and friends. I can also babysit if you and your partner want to leave at the last moment for the weekend. I will be the best ex-husband for any unfaithful wife. Thank you, Lewis, but this is all unnecessary. Stop it, Blaine. Don't mention this man's name to me, Lewis, he's a good guy. No, Blaine, not good. Let's get down to business. Whose idea was it to tell me about your relationship? It was him, Lewis. He said it's not good to deceive a good person like you. Lewis grinned mockingly, interrupting Blaine. Nonsense, Blaine, he said. He did it to make sure he gets the same reaction from me as he does from you. I've already asked if he's going to move in with you. Her eyes widened, and her mouth dropped open in surprise. Louis couldn't help but think that she looked like one of her favorite emojis. Blaine was silent, looking at her tightly clenched hands. Her posture was so tense and fragile that it seemed as if she was afraid that the slightest movement might break her. Blaine, Lewis said confidently, the evidence is right in front of you. He gestured at the papers she was holding in her hands. You are not the only one, and there will be others after you, his story speaks for itself. But he's different with me, she whispered softly. Lewis smiled knowingly and took a deep breath, feeling calmness envelop him. Another light breeze from his beloved lake touched his face, heralding the imminent end of the journey. Confident in his choice and controlling the risks, he was confident that everything would turn out exactly as he had planned. Speaking in a softer tone, he called out, "Look at me, Blaine. We're almost done. It's very important that you focus." When Blaine met his gaze, her tear-stained face showed a mixture of emotions reflecting her confusion. The mascara smeared, and my heart was filled with horror. The once perfect world was crumbling before my eyes. When she met Elle's gaze, she was met with a cold, stony expression and eyes as dark as night, penetrating into the very soul. "Take care of my girls, Blaine," he pleaded, his voice shaking with fear. "They're girls, LS," she protested weakly, embarrassed that her words had turned into a question. But LS' response was firm and relentless. "No, Blaine, it's not like that. These are my girls. You betrayed them and abandoned them just like you abandoned me. You're vulnerable and you can't control yourself. I need you to look after them for a while." "What do you mean?" Her fear was almost palpable. "I will never let them go." "But you've already let them go. You just don't know it yet. Your boyfriend will appreciate it, honey. Try some of this. This will enhance your intimacy. Your physical connection will be incredibly intense. All your senses will ignite. He's going to start introducing you to his friends soon. Come on, darling. Justin is a good guy." Blaine slowly shook her head, staring into space, and whispered, "He won't betray me." "Go to hell, Blaine," Lewis exclaimed, his anger obvious. "In a few months, this jerk will be molesting women in his usual places." Lewis was furious, But fortunately, I still have a couple of years until I finish the courses required to get a bachelor's degree in firefighting. When this is done, I will be able to apply for the role of fire marshal when Frank retires. Then I won't have so many mandatory hours. Most likely, it will coincide with the fall. That's when I'll seek full custody. By then, you might be too carried away to even notice it. You're wrong. He's not who you think he is. Please, Lewis, stop it. I love our family, can't you see? She cried angrily. You've never understood me. I truly believe that you are capable of loving only yourself, and I foolishly fell in love with the one I thought you were. I was just a pawn in your game. The girls only increased your control over me, and when your terrible boyfriend showed up, you immediately fell into his trap. You left your family without a second thought. Maybe we can try again, she said with tears in her eyes. No, Blaine, we can't. We don't have anything else to start over. I saw that you are not capable of true love and compassion. You hide behind a facade of contentment, but deep down, you know the truth. You are entangled in a web of lies and denial, unable to break free. The fear of facing your own shortcomings keeps you tied to a toxic relationship. It's time to acknowledge the reality of the situation and find the strength to let go of the charade. Only then will you be able to truly recover and find true happiness and satisfaction. It will be difficult for you to accept the truth of what I have learned. Now you have to face your true self and accept it for the rest of your miserable existence. But if I'm wrong and you really share a deep love, it won't be long before your charming partner starts hinting that you have childcare responsibilities. He may suggest that I take on more responsibilities, hinting that you don't know how to prioritize. You shouldn't object to him for fear of losing the idealized intimacy that you both share. When you informed me that I would have to share you with this parasite, it reminded me of your previous words. If he decides to leave you after he proposed, persuaded, and eventually threatened that he would do it if you didn't give the girls to me, then you'll go back to where you started, won't you? He chuckled when he saw her puzzled expression. In the end, I'll win and you'll lose. It's only a matter of time, and I'm willing to wait. Lewis looked back at the serene blue lake. The breeze died down for a moment, and the water became as still as glass. It was the signal to set sail. He promised himself that he would return here often with his daughters. Although his girls already adored this place, he wanted them to cherish it as deeply as he did. When he got to his feet, not because he was done, but because the adrenaline surging in him no longer allowed him to stay in place, he realized that he had to solve the last important issue with her. Lewis carefully walked around the bench, wrapping his arms tightly around the lacquer teak, and bent down to whisper in Blaine's ear. In a low voice full of anger, he warned her to tell her lover that if he ever crossed the line in a relationship with his daughters, whether it was using illegal drugs or inappropriate behavior, it would entail serious consequences. I will spy on him. I'll finish him off. Let him know that he doesn't need to hide or be on the lookout because I'll find him everywhere. I want him to understand in the last minutes of his life that I am responsible for ending his miserable existence on this planet. The same goes for you, Blaine. His voice was trembling and his throat was dry with tension. His grip was getting tighter, adrenaline pumping with every word he threw at her. Will you tell him that? Is that really you? Blaine asked. Lewis, and immediately there was a loud crack as the hardwood grate gave way. Blaine was startled by the unexpected noise, and Lewis curiously examined the broken piece, noting that it must be due to dry rot. Blaine refused to meet his eyes, bursting into tears and whimpering. Her body was shaking as if she was frozen. Remember, Blaine, it's 36 hours, not 37, Lewis reminded her before announcing, and now I'm leaving. Examining his hands, he noticed broken nails, bloody knuckles, and shards embedded in the skin. Surprisingly, he didn't feel any pain. Half a year later, Lewis was promoted, and he took his beloved daughters to himself. He was impatiently waiting for this moment, as Lewis had said. Blaine was just a temporary sweetheart for this bastard who offered her to his friends. Soon she ran away from the city and occasionally called the girls. Apparently, she understood how she was wrong, and she was ashamed that she had destroyed our family.